Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar brought to you by getAbstract. My name is Kirsten Muller-Doberman, and I'm going to be your host for today. We want to wish you a very special welcome. We're going to be talking about the powerful spark of curiosity. And we're going to be hearing from Chief Learning Officer at Novartis and the author of The Curious Advantage, Simon Brown. Before we dive into our conversation, though, that's you. But before we dive into our conversation and to allow a few more people to sign on to the webinar, I just want to give you a few housekeeping notes before we begin. First of all, if you like, you can go ahead and in the chat feature here on GoToWebinar, you can tell us the city or the company that you're signing in from. We're always curious to know where people are joining us from and a little bit about you, so feel free to put that in the chat. Also, at any time, you can type in a question. We will be moderating those and trying to post them to Simon throughout the conversation. Also, just to let you know, as the recording said, you are muted. And we also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. So after the webinar, you will be receiving a recording for internal usage. And if you have any other questions about that, you can email us at any time at corporate@getAbstract.com. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest. We're going to start chatting about what curiosity is, why it's essential for organizations today, and what we can do to cultivate it. Our guest today is, as I mentioned, Simon Brown. He's the Chief Learning Officer for Novartis, which is a leading global medicine company based in Switzerland. He's also the author of the Amazon best-selling book, The Curious Advantage. He's leading the strategy for Novartis to go big on learning in support of the company-wide culture transformation to become what they call curious, inspired, and unbossed. Before Novartis, Simon led the enterprise-wide learning transformation at Lloyds Banking Group. Previously, he led the UK learning strategy offering at Accenture and co-founded one of the UK's leading e-learning companies, Brightwave. He has worked with leading global organizations, including Microsoft, HSBC, Barclays, BT, Canon, and BP. Over the last year, the Novartis team have picked up multiple learning awards for their work to develop the 108,000 associates at Novartis, including the ATD Best Award, Cornerstone's Learning Strategy Innovation Award, and a Chief Learning Officer Award. So, Simon, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Kirsten. Great to be here.
Yeah, so to begin, why don't you tell us a little bit about what a Chief Learning Officer does? And I would be interested to know how that role has changed over the past 6 months in light of the pandemic.
Absolutely. So thank you. So Chief Learning Officer for Novartis. So Novartis, as you mentioned, is a focused medicines company. So we have 108,000 associates in countries all around the world. And we produce medicines that last year touched 800 million patients, so a significant impact on society. And we need to make sure that all 108,000 associates and all of the contractors that work with us as well have the right skills in order to be able to help us on our journey to reimagine medicine. So as Chief Learning Officer and with our amazing learning team that we have throughout the world, we work to make sure that we're building the right skills to make sure that everyone can perform their jobs and ultimately support those patients. In terms of how that's changed, so COVID's obviously had a very significant impact on us, like all other companies. We had a weekend earlier in the year where about 60,000 people switched over the course of that weekend to working remotely. So as a learning organisation, it's in how do we help the rest of the business to actually be able to work in that new way. So that meant making sure we had access to the right resources that people needed to be able to use new tools. So we started using Microsoft Teams almost over the course of that weekend. So if we looked at the most popular learning courses in that first week, it was essentials of how to use Microsoft Teams. I think the second week, people had then got to grips with how to use the technology. So the most popular program then was around time management, working from home, which also included sort of how to set yourself up and all of these pieces. And then as time went on, also things like resilience came in, and you know, how do you manage the stress and the different ways of working. So as a learning team, we were looking at how can we support people to make sure that they've got access to everything that they need to be able to change or sort of manage through that change that they were experiencing.
Yeah, I would imagine learning has taken on a whole different context in light of all the changes of the last several months.
Absolutely.
So you're the author of the book, The Curious Advantage, which has really taken off with your co-authors, Paul Ashcroft and Garrick Jones. And I'd love to know what motivated you to write the book and why is it so important right now?
Yeah, so the motivation to write the book came from, I think it was around April last year, where a couple of people in the course of a week said you should write a book about what we're doing at Novartis. And I took that to heart and was having dinner with Paul and Garrick that I've known for many years, and they'd previously written a book, Alive, around digital. So I was picking their brains, how would you write a book, what's involved, etc. And they offered to help. So I think that was a very wise decision to take on their offer of help, because otherwise I don't think it would have got finished, and it certainly wouldn't be as diverse as it is now. We're bringing in different viewpoints. I think it has made it much richer. But it evolved from being sort of about the Novartis story to being more broadly around curiosity, and looks at some of the history of curiosity and through societies over the ages, goes into then why is curiosity so important and some of the benefits for an individual or for an organization, and then there's a model which we can talk about in more detail that goes through how you can be more curious as well. And in terms of why I think curiosity now is if you like, being talked about more. I mean, if we go back not so many years, then it's very clear how things worked. And as an organization, if you're a manufacturing organization, people came into work and they went through a particular process, operating machines, and everything was relatively stable. Whereas the digital world that we operate in now, there's so much ambiguity, there's so much uncertainty, there's so much speed of change that we need a way that we can adapt to that. And Astro Teller, who's got the amazing job title of something like head of moonshots at Google X, he came up with this diagram that shows the rate of change of humans or human adaptability, and then the rate of change of technology. And we see that technology is exponentially expanding and changing, and as humans we can only adapt more slowly, and that's why it feels so fast, I guess, around us, because technology is changing faster than we've traditionally been able to adapt. And his suggestion for how we address that gap is to learn faster. And curiosity is one of the things that helps us to learn faster. It helps us to explore in ambiguity, to test out different things. I think that's why now, with this fast-changing world, with skills changing so rapidly, that the curiosity seems to be coming of age.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I think the title for the webinar, The Spark of Curiosity, is so great, because learning requires in some ways inspiration, right? Not just roteness, but it needs that spark of inspiration. And we're going to talk about what it takes to spark curiosity. But before we do, we'd like to hear from you about how curious you feel your organization might be, and what your views on curiosity may be. So we're going to put up a poll here asking you what your views are. Curiosity, I've never really thought about it. I like the idea of being curious, but don't really have the time. I consider myself curious and I'm always learning something new. Or curiosity is my middle name. Questioning, learning, and exploring is what I'm all about. So we'll give you a few seconds to think about maybe the role that curiosity has played in your personal life or your professional life, and answer accordingly. And then we'll take a look at those results and chat with Simon about them.
Interested to see how curious everyone is.
I know, I think that a lot of people are going to choose the second one. I like the idea of being curious, but don't really have the time.
Yep.
It's the time management piece. But you're going to give us some strategies to work through that, because
Absolutely.
It doesn't have to be that way. And I know that you've seen a lot of growth and some really tangible, measurable results from the work that you've done at Novartis. So we're going to close the poll here. Give you guys a few more seconds and then take a look at the results. So let's check those results. Let's bring them up. Nope.
All right.
There we go. Okay. So
my curious audience.
My assumption was totally wrong. Only 3% I've never thought about it. 8% like it, but don't have the time. 63%. So most of you say, consider myself
very
curious.
good.
Bravo. That's why you're here, right? But then
26% are already there. Yep.
questioning, learning, and exploring is what I'm all about. That's really cool, and I think that gives inspiration to other people as well, that are watching this. Great. So we'll close those results. And Simon, I'd love to kind of start to dig into this now. So what does it take from leaders as well as employees to create a culture of curiosity, no matter what industry that they are working in?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe start with what do we mean when we're talking about curiosity? So the definition or the description we like to use around it is that curiosity is having an attitude of wonder with a spirit of exploration. So it's that constantly asking, wondering why, exploring, but with a spirit of exploration to actually do something about it. So how do we create a culture that is using those ideas? We did some analysis at Novartis looking at culture to see the impact, interestingly, around culture on performance. So will culture drive the right performance? And what we found maybe is surprising was that actually culture has no impact on performance, which wasn't what we expected. But why that's the case is because it needs to be a specific type of culture, which is why I think your question is key, because within the context of Novartis, we were looking at the attributes for our culture, which is around inspired, curious, and unbossed. And what we found was there was a very strong correlation between those traits, being inspired, so people coming with a sense of purpose, being curious, constantly learning, questioning, being unbossed, and having essentially sort of servant leadership and managers being there to create a diverse team and ensure that ideas come out, etc. Those traits of inspired, curious, and unbossed do have a very strong correlation through to performance. So that curious element of having a curious culture, we can see if you can create that, then there is a strong linkage through. And why a pure culture has no link is because culture could be anything. You could have a toxic culture, you could have a positive culture. So it has to be particular cultural traits. So around a curious culture, so what we see that it takes, a big part of that is around learning. So around being able to have the resources to be able to learn, build skills. But back to what you were mentioning as we had those questions up, it's not just having access to great learning resources, but it's also having the time and the space to be able to take advantage of that. And what we saw within Novartis was two of the biggest barriers that associates were telling us around having time to learn was that, well, or taking up that learning was that they don't have the time to be able to do that time was a blocker, but also that manager support was a blocker as well. And those were the two biggest things that came out, getting in the way, if you like, of that culture around curiosity. So to address that, what we came up with was an aspiration and support for all associates to be able to spend 5% of their time in learning, exploring, and being curious. So that equates to about 100 hours a year. And the reason we did that, not because 100 hours is the absolute right number of hours that anyone should do, but it was more as a symbol around the company supports learning, encourages learning, and wants people to be curious and to be spending time building and developing themselves. And therefore setting a goal of 100 hours creates the space that everyone can invest that time, and that managers can support and encourage people to be investing that time, because we look at it in different parts of the organization to see how we're tracking against that. So that was one of the big levers that we used in order to try and move the culture towards being more curious. The other part is being curious is beyond learning, so it also includes experimenting, asking questions, and having a safe environment that people can do that. So linked to our culture around unbossed is across our managers and leaders, how do we create the psychological safety in order that people can ask questions, can try things, can experiment, and can fail, because a part of experimentation is that things don't always work out. And if they always work out, you're probably not pushing yourself hard enough or far enough in terms of the bold questions that you're asking or the things that you're trying. So as part of a curious culture, there also needs to be that psychological safety there, and that environment where people can question, query, ask, experiment. And if those experiments aren't successful, we learn from that and we move on. So those are sort of two big elements, I guess, in terms of how we've tried to create that curious culture within Novartis. And we see that in other organizations as well, like Microsoft is a great example as well of a growth mindset or curiosity as a key part of their culture as well.
Yeah, and they've been a little successful with that, I think.
Yes, just a little, yeah.
Oh, no, great example. I'd like to get your take on, and you talked about it a little bit, but dive a little deeper in how important curiosity is in talent management, which is, I know, on everyone's minds right now as company culture and keeping employees happy and not burned out and growing and all these things very important at the moment.
Yeah, so I mean, there's many benefits within curiosity, which as we went into the research of the book, it almost surprised us of some of the things that are there. So there's 5 key benefits that we identified. So one hinted at a bit earlier around learning, but it actually, if you apply curiosity with learning, it actually aids your retention and almost sort of supercharges your learning. And that's based on the way that the brain works and the hippocampus and the curiosity firing dopamine, and that actually helping to strengthen the memories that are created. And that was based on University of California research a few years ago. There was also quoted in Harvard Business Review as the link between being curious and improved decision making. So that actually, by considering different alternatives and being curious about what happens if you explore in different ways, it can actually improve and enhance your decision making. We also see curiosity powering better communication because people listen better and communicate better and share their ideas in a better way. And it also reduces conflict within teams as well, so it enhances teamwork. Because rather than seeing someone's question as a challenge, you're curious to understand, why is it you would think like that? Why would you have a different opinion? Tell me more about that. And actually then removes conflict in that team environment and makes people work better as a team. And then finally, research from INSEAD looked at the link between curiosity and innovation, which perhaps is an intuitive one, but the more curious we are, the more we can discover, the more we can innovate. So all of those elements, it almost acts as a sort of a power skill or a sort of supercharges some of your other power skills, which then helps across many aspects of talent and so forth.
Absolutely. I love that changing the whole framework so there isn't conflict, but I'm curious as to why you asked that question.
Exactly.
That's so great, that reframing, and it also helps yourself as well. It also, not only mitigates conflict, but it helps you to be able to look at what could be a potentially conflictual situation and reframe it to something positive. Actually, I have a question from someone in our audience. They ask, are there any plans to go beyond a book? This topic lends itself to other formats. Any plans?
So we're working on the audio book at the moment, so that will be out soon. We're also working with or just starting to work with a business school at the moment around doing an organizational assessment around the 7 C's model that we can talk about in a moment, to help organizations in actually understanding how curious are they, and then what would one do to build on that. So that's the next step that we're thinking about at the moment, and just in the early stages of working together on that.
Great, cool. And we have a question about KPIs, but I'm going to ask you about how to measure the impact of these initiatives later. You mentioned the 7 C's. What are they? And if you could give us a brief description of each, that'd be great.
Yeah, so as we went through the research for the book, we were sort of bucketing the different things that, if you like, inspire and support curiosity. And before you knew it, we found we had 5 of the buckets actually began with the letter C. And I remember a conversation where I was chatting to Paul and Garrick. It's like, oh, actually, I've just been having a conversation with Jackie Brassey, who we mentioned in the book, who's a McKinsey consultant and academic, and she was making the link with confidence, of how the more curious you are, actually, there's a link with confidence. We're like, well, we've now got 6 C's. It's like that we must be able to come up with 7 C's, because with coming back to the definition of a spirit of exploration, actually, the link then to sailing the 7 C's and the 7 C's of curiosity, we had to make the link. So we shuffled around our 6 buckets to end up with 7 and end up with a model that takes you through the 7 C's. So I guess what is the model of the 7 C's? So it's really a model that helps in being curious and channeling that curiosity. So it starts with context. So first C is context. So understanding what's the context I'm in. Do I really understand the context that I'm in and what it is I want to be curious about? Because you can't just be broadly curious without focus. That's when you end up surfing the internet for hours and your curiosity doesn't take you anywhere. It's channeling that curiosity into something, a question that you want to explore. And then when you know what it is that you want to be curious about, who's the community out there that can help you? So who are the people that can guide, can explain, have more information around it, and can help you to understand what it is that you're curious about? And then through that understanding of the context and that engaging with the community, there's going to be a wealth of information that you come up with. So then you go through from that broad wealth of information to curate. So that's our third C, curate it down into the things that are going to be specifically helpful for addressing the question or the area that you're interested in. And then once you've gone through all of that, then what's the build that you can put on it? So what's the creativity that you can apply to the thing that you're curious about? So that may be the questions, it may be a different take, it may be an experiment that you can apply, you can test out something you're curious to think about. Asking those questions or coming up with that experiment is all very good, but you then need to do something to actually put it into action. And that's where then construction comes in. So construction is then putting your ideas in, that's an experiment, a test, trying things out. From that, you then get some results, and therefore you need to apply criticality. So criticality is what actually worked, what did the results tell you, what biases maybe did you bring with you? So did you have inherent biases in what you were doing? Maybe this is confirmation bias, that you're looking at the results and you're seeing what you want to see rather than what it actually telling you, or what other bias did you bring in? So applying criticality. And then going through all of that, what we found through the research is that then actually builds your confidence. So the going through that process, even if you were unsuccessful, if you like, in finding out the experiment that you did, it still builds your confidence. And while confidence is the seventh C, arguably it's also the first one, because it brings you back to the start. And then with that confidence, you can ask bolder questions, you can do bolder experiments, be more creative, and go through the cycle again. So start with context, find your community, then curate the content down, then add your creativity, then put that into action through construction, apply criticality, and that builds your confidence. So those are the 7.
Awesome. I love it. Thank you for walking us through those. And just a reminder to everyone watching that the Curious Advantage abstract is available on getAbstract.com in our library. So if this is fascinating to you, then please go ahead and read the abstract and read the entire book and share it with others in your organization on some really, really valuable tools. And that leads me to another poll, some feedback that we would love to get from all of you on how curious your organization is today. So we're going to put this poll up on the screen now, asking this question and wondering, curiosity? No, we wouldn't want to have anything like that. Hopefully that's not many of you. My main learning time is compliance related. I'm encouraged to learn and occasionally try a new approach, or my work is all about learning and experimenting. And I know that we have a wide variety of different industries represented here in our audience today, as well as globally different cultures. So it would be really, really fascinating to see kind of how people view the company that they work in. And if maybe you feel like your organization is not doing very well in this, maybe some of the tools that we're learning today, you can go back and share with your colleagues and spark some curiosity of your own. Give you a few more seconds and then we'll take a look at our results here.
I'm hoping we haven't got too many of the first one, but you never know.
Well, that's why you wrote the book, right, Simon?
Exactly. Oh yeah, maybe I should look at it the other way around.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's really good. All right, just wrapping up here. All right, we are going to take a peek at those results coming up on the screen in just a few seconds. And there we go. So how curious is your organization? Most people said, I'm encouraged to learn and occasionally try a new approach, more than half. That's
Very
really
good.
awesome. Yeah, I'm also very glad that just 2% say that their organization isn't curious at all.
And maybe a quarter of people in organizations that value curiosity. That's great.
Yeah, that was great. So we'll take those poll results down, and I think that's really great, showing them the momentum is moving in the right direction. And it kind of, as a good segue, that leads me to want to ask, so what do companies risk if they don't try to build a curious culture in their workplace?
Yeah, so I guess there's several different aspects of it. So if we take the learning aspect within curiosity, then if you haven't got the culture where people are constantly learning and are able to invest the time in building new skills, then ultimately over time you're going to end up with an organization that is bringing out of date skills to what they're doing. So, and a lot of the research is showing that new skills are coming all the time. So Gartner research talks about how a third of people have learned a new to world skill in the last 3 years. So a new to world skill is something that didn't exist 3 years ago, maybe like blockchain, aspects of AI and data science, bot management. These are things that didn't exist really 3 years ago, and a third of people have now learned those. 19% of people, or 90% of the skills that we have today will be irrelevant in 3 years' time. So nearly 20% of what we all rely on will be irrelevant in 3 years' time. So if you're not constantly being curious and learning those new skills, then the things that made us successful 5 years ago, if we're still applying those skills, that knowledge, those models, the competition is going to have moved on and have the latest skills, the latest thinking, and before you know it, you get left behind as an organization. So having that curiosity to be able to be constantly learning new things is one part. And then the sort of questioning and the experimentation and the safety to try and fail is the other part. So if the world is moving so fast, if you haven't got the culture where it's safe to experiment and try things, everyone is going to be very reserved in pushing things forward, and you're not going to get the innovations, you're not going to get the breakthrough ways of doing things. We did some interesting research within Novartis around the role that a manager plays, and we looked at if people consider their manager favourable or unfavourable, what impact does that have on curiosity? And we saw curiosity and engagement, in fact. And we saw the difference between a sort of average perceived manager and a favourably perceived manager was about 3 points. So some difference, but not huge. Whereas the difference between a favourably perceived manager and an unfavourably perceived manager was about 18 points. So a huge difference on engagement. And the dimension of engagement that was most impacted was curiosity. So there was actually a 22-point difference between a favourable and unfavourable manager in the area of curiosity. So it sort of makes sense that if you've got a manager who isn't supporting you, who's not, if you fail, that they're coming down on you, they're penalizing you for that failure, you're going to play it safe. If they don't encourage you to question, you're going to hold back your thoughts, and you end up with you don't get the innovation, you don't get the speak up, you don't get the pushing boundaries, and it's all heavily influenced then by the manager. So I guess for all managers and leaders on the call, so think to yourself, are you encouraging people to speak up? Are you encouraging people to share their voice, even if it's a dissenting voice from what everyone else thinks, or to try things even if those don't always work, because that's what's going to create the innovation. It's that curiosity that's going to spark the new things and new better ways of doing things, rather than playing it safe and doing it the way that we've always done it. Because the world is moving so fast, if we do it the way we've always done it, yeah, again, we fall behind quickly. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to remember as well that there is a great amount of risk involved, as you just outlined, if organizations and the people within them don't do this, but there are steps to get there. Like, we don't have to feel like, oh, this wave of overwhelming change is coming and we're all stuck, but there are tools, as you've been talking about this entire time, to get there, that it doesn't have to make anyone, especially someone in leadership, feel overwhelmed, but there are solutions. Now we're going to get to this question that came in. Are there any KPIs demonstrating that companies with curious employees are more successful? And that kind of ties in with the question I wanted to ask you about how you measure the impact of these initiatives within an organization.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, one of the things we're working on as one of the next steps off the back of the book is how do we better assess curiosity and really sort of measure organizational curiosity. But at the moment, one of the ways that we're measuring it from a Novartis context is we're using learning hours as our proxy for curiosity. And on one hand, you can argue learning hours are irrelevant because it's just an input of people spending time. But if people are spending time on things that are aligned to the strategy and they're spending time on things that are great quality learning from world-class institutions, then all of that is actually working towards something positive. So we've been looking at learning hours overall. We actually had 3 years of declining learning hours through to 2018, which is when we started on this journey, and we had 22.6 hours on average across Novartis associates in 2018. But as we started on encouraging curiosity and we made learning resources more available, encouraging people to spend time, we saw over a 50% increase in the amount of learning hours between 2018 and 2019. So we're at 35.8 learning hours in 2019. And at the same time, we also then looked at our quarterly pulse surveys to see what's the engagement around learning, and we asked people the question there around, I have great opportunities to learn and develop. And 18 months ago, we were behind the industry benchmark at 68 points there. And as we went through the quarters and through those quarterly pulse surveys, we saw a gradual increase. So this year, when we saw beginning of this year 72, so 2 points ahead of benchmark. And in the last survey, we saw 74, which was 4 points ahead of benchmark. So we went from 2 points behind around learning and essentially curiosity to 4 points ahead over the course of the last 18 months, as we saw that learning hours increasing. So those are two metrics that we look at as a measure. We then also look in more detail at specific skills. So we can also see particularly skills tied to our strategy. So we have a goal around going big on data and digital, key part of our 5 strategic pillars. And we can drill into some of the skills within there. So something like data visualization, we can see how 18 months ago we were behind, again, industry benchmark on data visualization. And we can see then that skill level gradually increasing to about Q3, Q4 last year, where it equaled the industry norm, and then now we're ahead of that in terms of amount of skills and the level of those skills. So a mixture of learning hours, the engagement survey data around learning, but also then deeper diving into specific skills indices to see how those skills are moving, and all of those sort of give us an indication around curiosity. But we're then looking at how do we roll that up into broader metrics as well that we can use. And that then ties through. We had as a company, we had a fantastic performance, arguably our sort of best ever performance last year. So we haven't made the correlation there, and I'm not going to say that one thing drives the other, but that happened at the same time. So.
Yeah, we have a couple more questions coming in, just a little bit more about this measurement. Seems to be sparking a lot of curiosity. Oh my gosh, sorry. It's so easy now. It's in my brain. It keeps coming up. About this topic, someone wants to know, must employees set business-related learning goals, or are personal learning goals within this 5% of their working time possible as well?
Yeah, so we don't have to tie it directly to business goals. Ideally, if we're going to be tracking it, it has some sort of relevance, but it doesn't have to be directly attributable. So I went off and learned swimming or something, I wouldn't suggest doing that within the 5% of time, but taking a very broad learning is absolutely encouraged. And we recently interviewed Vas Narasimhan, our CEO, around this, and he talks about the value of range, and in fact he was referencing David Epstein's book Range, of how having a very broad knowledge and actually going into areas outside of one's immediate need for one's role actually can unlock insight that one can then bring back. So actually by learning something completely different, maybe there's a spark of inspiration there that then you can bring back, and actually it moves things forward in your day-to-day role. So the 5% is around anything that you're curious about. It doesn't have to directly relate to your role.
Yeah. And that leads to another one. Someone asks, what percentage of my day should I invest in exploring and learning?
Yeah, so I guess it's 5% of your overall time, so 5% of your day. So it's essentially a day a month that equates to. And we have flexible learning models, so one can learn through lots of different ways, so podcasts and audiobooks, etc., etc. It doesn't all have to be formal classroom, especially at the moment, training or learning. But how people want to use that time will vary. Some people want to do half an hour, a couple of days a week. Some will want to block a day once a month in order to do that learning. It's really flexible for people to do in whatever way works best for them. So.
Cool. Someone asks, can Simon please elaborate on cultural trait alignment?
Cultural trait alignment. So yeah, I can interpret that in maybe a few ways. So I guess we talked about the sort of cultural traits aligned to performance. So there was the linkage there. So certain cultural traits, and within Novartis we did the research for inspired, curious, and unbossed, and we saw those cultural traits very strongly aligned to performance, and specifically performance in knowledge workers that research was around. So if you have people who are inspired by a sense of purpose, that they have the energy to be able to deliver against that, then that drives performance. That people are curious, questioning, always looking for better ways, exploring different ways of doing things, that drives performance. And if managers and leaders are there to be able to create a safe team environment where people can share their views, and with a mentality around actually probably the answer will come from the team rather than coming from the leader saying this is how it should be, then that sort of unbossed principle, then those three traits will drive to performance based on the research that we did.
Cool. And another question, and these are great, so keep them coming if you have any more. We've got a few more minutes here left in the webinar, so we're happy to pose those questions to you, Simon. Someone asks, curiosity is many times diminished by fear of conflict. It seems that bravery is required to challenge mainstream perspectives. How do we work on that?
Yeah, so that absolutely is one of the things that can stop curiosity. And for the book, we interviewed Dr. Diane Hamilton, who has written a book called Cracking the Curiosity Code, and she in there looks at some of the barriers for an individual to being curious. So what are the things that actually stop me from being curious? And there's 4 factors that she identified. So, and she uses the acronym FATE. So first one is around fear. Second one is around assumptions, third one is around technology, and the fourth one is around environment. So the first of those is exactly to this question, which is around fear. So overcoming that fear to be curious, and finding, I guess, ways to do that, whether that's I guess it all comes down to what's actually generating that fear. So is it actually self-created fear, or is it imposed by management or leadership or something, as we referenced earlier, maybe constraining it? But it would be worth checking out her research around the barriers that can stop you from being curious.
Another great question. How do you retain talent in a curious organization?
So interestingly, so we're doing some work at the moment to try to correlate learning through to retention. So an aspect of curiosity, I guess, but a significant aspect. And what we're seeing in our early data at the moment, and we're just getting it to a point where we can be absolutely confident, but it looks like the more time people are spending learning and being curious, actually the lower the likelihood of them leaving the organization. And we're able to actually correlate X amount of more hours of learning and being curious would result in a 15% reduction in the likelihood of someone actually leaving the organization. And I know from talking to CLO at another organization, they've done similar research themselves, and they've seen that link between increased learning and a reduction in attrition, so increased retention. So there seems to be a strong linkage there, and that's hugely powerful, because the value or the cost of attrition to a large organization is enormous. So actually the argument that one can make there around actually, spend a bit more on learning, because if it keeps people within the organization for longer, because you're inspiring them to be curious, that's an interesting business case to explore.
And I would think also that if you see that it's not just you that's investing time in learning, but it's all of the people around you, and feel that the
Mhm.
organization is invested in you as an employee, that builds a lot of goodwill and trust that's essential right now as well.
Absolutely.
Um,
Yeah.
Really great question here. Are there boundaries when it comes to being curious?
It's interesting. When we were looking at the history around curiosity, it was a few hundred years ago, and actually it was considered dangerous to be curious. And actually, it could be your life could be at risk if you were perceived to be curious in parts of the world in the Middle Ages. So there certainly historically have been boundaries around being curious. Also, I guess if we look at curiosity, where I often ask the question around, are you born curious, or does it change along the way? And if we look at how children are curious, then there are boundaries there that we as parents often impose upon our children to try to limit their curiosity. Don't touch that. Don't eat that, don't do that, stop asking why. Often there's a safety element where we're imposing boundaries to limit curiosity. The challenge is to not over limit the curiosity, though, and allow still an element, which having two children, I know is not always easy, particularly when they're young and you're getting why. How do you sort of keep encouraging the curiosity versus sometimes just, that's the way it is, stop asking why. So I think there's certainly boundaries there from a safety element. I think from an organizational element, maybe less so, that actually taking away the boundaries so that you can actually be more openly curious, I guess, may create some of the innovations and so forth that you want. We do have a podcast that goes with the with the book, and we were recently interviewing someone for that around a studio in the UK, music studio, and they were talking about the creativity and the curiosity of one of the bands that were there. And they took their creativity to new limits, where they actually sent someone out to go and get chicken drumsticks from the butcher to be able to play the drums with chicken bones to see if there was a new sound that they could get. But we sort of use that as what's our organizational equivalent of sending someone out to buy chicken bones to play the drums. It's sort of what's the completely far out there wacky idea, but actually in that instance, it may have made their album actually sound the way that they wanted it to sound, and this was a very well-known band that did it. So I think sometimes maybe not having the boundaries to our curiosity may actually lead us to come up with better results.
Great answer. Last question. I'm actually going to end with this one. It's from our audience, and it's a wonderful one to end on. Simon, how do you build your reading list? What are you reading right now?
So currently, Simon Sinek, Start With Why. So I'm about 3/4 of the way through that. Next on my reading list is this one, which is The Socially Dynamic Organization by Julian Stodd. So how do I choose my reading list? I think it comes through recommendations. I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn looking at the latest articles, latest things that organizations are doing, etc. And so there's quite often recommendations of books that I see on there as well. Obviously, getAbstract is also regularly prompting me to look at some of the new books that are coming out as well. So range of different sources, but yeah, trying to keep abreast of some of the latest ideas that are out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And Simon Sinek's Start With Why is actually in our getAbstract library as well, as is the Curious Advantage. So if this has sparked your interest, I do want to encourage you to check out the Curious Advantage. The abstract is in our library. We've got 22,000 books summarized in our library. So if this has inspired you to want to get out there and learn something, whether it's something nonfiction, business related, or you want to check out a classic, we have a classics library, which I've kept thinking of Alice in Wonderland during this entire conversation, because Alice always says curiouser and curiouser as she keeps following the animals through
Absolutely.
Wonderland. So just there's a lot of broad application here. Simon, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. We really, really appreciate you spending this hour with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, all of you, for being here. Before you sign out, just want to remind you that this webinar was recorded and you will be receiving the recording via email in a few days. Of course, check out The Curious Advantage by Simon Brown on the getAbstract library. And of course, if you have any other questions, comments, or just want to say hi, you can email us at any time at corporate@getAbstract.com. From all of us here at the team, we're wishing you a wonderful rest of your day. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.
Thank you.